The morning started like any other in the luxurious Brentwood neighborhood, sun spilling over manicured lawns and the quiet hum of early traffic drifting along the streets. But inside the sprawling $13.5 million estate of Rob and Michelle Reiner, something unspeakable had occurred, something that would shatter not just a family, but the public perception of one of Hollywood's most beloved figures. Imagine walking into your home, the place that should be your sanctuary, and finding the people you love most gone. Gone in a way so violent, so incomprehensible, that the mind struggles to process it. This was no accident. This was murder. And it was not random. It was personal. The details that would eventually emerge would stun a nation. Rob Reiner, the acclaimed filmmaker known for classics that touched hearts across generations, and Michelle Reiner, his devoted wife, had been found dead in their home, victims of multiple sharp force injuries, according to the Los Angeles County Medical Examiner. Their son, Nick Reiner, a 32-year-old living in the guest house on the property, was arrested that very night and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. But while the headlines screamed of shock and disbelief, the story running beneath the surface, the story that had been quietly festering in the shadows of this seemingly perfect family, was far darker. Because the tragedy, it turns out, didn't start with that fateful Sunday. It started decades before, in whispered arguments, unresolved resentments, and secrets so deep they threatened to swallow the family whole. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. And then there was Tracy Reiner, the eldest daughter, whose name had recently surfaced in court, in a revelation that no one, neither the media, nor Hollywood insiders, nor the general public, was prepared to hear. Tracy, once seen as the poised, accomplished daughter of a famous filmmaker, broke down in court as her youngest sister, Romy Reiner, delivered testimony that would send shockwaves through everyone who had known the family. Romy's words were simple yet devastating. "She killed my mom and dad." Those words, spoken with a combination of grief, anger, and raw certainty, redefined everything. Up until that moment, the world had focused on Nick, the son, as the prime suspect. But now, the narrative had splintered, the safe assumptions of family loyalty shattered, and a much more terrifying possibility emerged. Could it be that the person closest to their parents, the one who had grown up in the same home, who had shared birthdays, holidays, and milestones, had played a part in orchestrating this nightmare? Before we dive deeper, it's important to set the stage, to understand the lives and relationships that existed before the crime. Rob Reiner, at 78, had spent a lifetime crafting stories on screen that explored the best and worst of human behavior. He was the mind behind films that made audiences laugh, cry, and question the world around them. Michelle Reiner, at 70, had been his partner, the silent force behind the public image of stability, the woman who managed a complex household while supporting the ambitions of her children. Together, they had built not just a family, but an image of perfection. An image that would now be questioned, dissected, and ultimately deconstructed in the public eye. But even the most polished images hide cracks, and in this family, those cracks were deep and jagged. For years, those close to the Reiners noted tension between the siblings. Tracy, the eldest, had always carried a certain weight, the expectation of responsibility, perhaps even the burden of a moral compass that she sometimes failed to honor. Romy, the youngest, had a different kind of innocence. A clarity unclouded by years of complicated family dynamics. And then there was Nick, whose actions would become the most visible and public manifestation of the family's dysfunction. Yet as Romy's testimony would later reveal, Nick was not the only one capable of betrayal. There had been whispers, small hints, that Tracy's relationship with her parents was far more complicated than the public had ever been allowed to see. The heartbreak, the resentment, the anger, all of it had been carefully concealed behind smiles and holiday photos, behind red carpet appearances and Hollywood premieres. Imagine for a moment what it must have been like for Romy, standing in that courtroom, looking at her sister, the sister who had shared her childhood, her home, and her parents' love, and speaking words that could change the course of the investigation entirely. "She killed my mom and dad." It is the kind of statement that freezes a room, halts proceedings, and turns every eye on the person being accused. In that instant, Tracy's composure, carefully maintained for decades, began to crumble. And in the moments that followed, the full horror of the family's story began to surface. Not as rumor, not as conjecture, but as hard, harrowing allegations that demanded attention. The story that unfolded in the weeks following the murders is one that will leave you questioning everything you think you know about family, trust, and betrayal. It is a story of a family torn apart not by external forces, but by the hidden currents of resentment, jealousy, and perhaps even greed. Each revelation, each testimony, each piece of evidence adds a layer of complexity that makes the tragedy both inevitable and utterly shocking. How could a family so public, so admired, fall apart in such a violent and final way? How could love transform into something so deadly? These are the questions that will follow us through this hour-long journey into the heart of one of Hollywood's darkest and most intimate tragedies. We begin not just with the crime itself, but with the lives that led to it. We examine the relationships, the tensions, and the secrets that festered silently behind closed doors. We explore the moments that hinted at future catastrophe, the red flags that were overlooked, and the subtle signs of discord that were missed by everyone except those living within the walls of the Reiner estate. And as we do, we begin to understand that the murder of Rob and Michelle Reiner was not an isolated act of violence. It was the culmination of years of hidden conflict, of unresolved grievances, and of betrayals that had slowly poisoned the family from the inside out. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of this story is not just the act of violence itself, but the revelation that the person accused may not have been who we expected. Nick Reiner's arrest captured the headlines, and for a time, it seemed the story was straightforward: a troubled son, acting out in a fit of rage, committing an unthinkable act. Yet Romy's courtroom testimony shattered that narrative, suggesting a complicity, a deeper involvement that went beyond Nick. If true, the implications are staggering, not just legally, but morally and emotionally. It forces us to reconsider the nature of family, the assumptions we make about loyalty, and the darkness that can exist behind even the most seemingly perfect facades. This story is not just a crime report. It is an exposé on human behavior under extreme circumstances. It is a look at how grief, jealousy, and long-standing resentment can combine to create something lethal. It is a portrait of a family, once admired and envied, brought low by the very people who should have been their closest allies. And as we move forward, chapter by chapter, you will encounter moments that are almost impossible to believe, contradictions that will challenge your understanding, and emotional beats that will leave you questioning what it truly means to be part of a family. Every revelation will push you further into the story. Every cliffhanger will demand your attention, and every emotional spike will make you wonder, how did it all come to this? By the end of this introduction, you may be asking yourself, how could a family that seemed so normal, so beloved, descend into this kind of tragedy? The answer is complicated. It is tangled in decades of relationships, in decisions made behind closed doors, and in secrets that were never meant to see the light of day. But what is certain is this: the events that unfolded in that Brentwood estate did not happen in a vacuum. They were the result of a complex web of dynamics, emotions, and actions that intersected at the worst possible moment. And while the world initially focused on Nick as the prime suspect, the story is far more layered and far more shocking than anyone could have imagined. As we move into the chapters ahead, keep in mind this single question: could someone you love, someone you trust implicitly, be capable of betraying you in the most devastating way imaginable? Romy's words are the key to understanding this question, and her testimony will guide us through the darkness, revealing truths that have long been hidden. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. They say every family has its secrets, but some secrets are heavier than others. So heavy that they can crush the very foundation of what you thought was love, trust, and loyalty. The Reiners, to the outside world, were the picture of perfection. Rob Reiner, the legendary filmmaker whose name evokes classics that define generations, and Michelle, his elegant, devoted wife, lived a life that most could only dream of. Their children, Nick, Tracy, and Romy, seemed well-adjusted, polished, and poised, growing up in the grandeur of Brentwood, attending elite schools, traveling in comfort, and experiencing the kind of Hollywood life most people see only in magazines. On the surface, it was idyllic, a family that smiled for cameras, attended premieres, hosted holiday gatherings, and maintained the kind of social life that was aspirational to many. But perfection, as we are about to see, is often just a mask. Behind the smiles and the carefully curated Instagram moments, cracks had already formed, tiny fissures at first, easily overlooked, but over time, growing into chasms. These cracks weren't obvious to neighbors or casual acquaintances. They weren't visible to fans of Rob Reiner's films or even to the Hollywood elite who casually mingled with the family at premieres and charity events. But inside the Reiner home, the tension was real, palpable, and simmering beneath a veneer of civility. Tracy Reiner, the eldest daughter, had always carried the weight of responsibility. She was the child who others looked to for guidance, for assurance, for control. She had grown up navigating the expectations of a father who was both a cultural icon and a demanding presence in their lives. Rob Reiner, as brilliant as he was, could be exacting. Every detail mattered. Every decision weighed against an unspoken standard of success and propriety. Tracy, like many eldest children in high-achieving families, internalized this pressure. It became part of her identity, part of the armor she wore to navigate not just the world outside, but the world within her own family. Romy, on the other hand, was the youngest and, in many ways, the most unguarded. There was a clarity in her innocence, a sharpness in her perception that sometimes made her seem wiser than her years. She saw what was happening behind the curtains, the unspoken arguments, the simmering frustrations, and the quiet resentments that Tracy tried to hide. She observed patterns that no outsider could, but even she couldn't fully comprehend how far things might eventually go. And then there was Nick, the middle child, or perhaps more accurately, the child whose presence would later dominate headlines in ways none of the family could have anticipated. Nick's history with his parents was complicated. Those close to the family would later reveal that Nick had struggled with anger, impulsiveness, and a sense of detachment that worried his parents. It was not unusual for family tensions to arise between siblings, especially in households with privilege, pressure, and high expectations. But in the Reiner home, these tensions were often masked by smiles and social appearances. To the world, the children were thriving. To the parents, there were concerns. Concerns that perhaps they had tried to overlook, hoping time or distance would heal. But time rarely heals everything. In fact, in some families, it can accumulate resentments like sediment, layering grievances, misunderstandings, and jealousies until the foundation can no longer hold. And that is precisely what had been happening in the Reiner household for years. Small disputes over inheritance, subtle rivalries over attention, disagreements about parental favoritism. These were the tiny fractures that, left unaddressed, would eventually become fissures deep enough to threaten the entire family structure. Even within a family of accomplished individuals, human emotions are unpredictable, messy, and sometimes terrifying. Tracy had ambitions, successes, and a carefully cultivated public persona. Romy had an awareness and sensitivity that would later give her the courage to speak out. And Nick, whose name would become synonymous with tragedy, carried shadows in his psyche that neither distance, discipline, nor love had been able to dissipate. It was a cocktail of circumstances, behaviors, and hidden grievances, a volatile mix that no one could have imagined culminating in the horror that would unfold on that fateful Sunday. And yet, despite the tension beneath the surface, the Reiners had moments of true connection. They celebrated birthdays lavishly, took trips that seemed picture-perfect, and maintained a sense of family unity in public. For outsiders, this could easily be misread as evidence that nothing was wrong. After all, the human mind has a tendency to trust appearances, to assume that smiling faces hide nothing more than fleeting disagreements. But inside the walls of their Brentwood estate, a storm was brewing, one that would erupt violently, leaving no one unscathed. Think about the irony of it. A family so celebrated for love, accomplishment, and unity would be undone not by external forces, but by the very people who were supposed to protect it from harm. The betrayal that would occur was not an abstract concept. It was not something that could be blamed on circumstance alone. It was intimate, personal, and almost unimaginable. For Romy, standing in court years later and recounting the events leading up to her parents' death, the sense of disbelief was compounded by a profound awareness. The danger had always been inside the home. The threat was familial. The horror was inescapable because it came from the people who were closest to the victims. When you hear stories like this, it's natural to ask, how could anyone turn on the people who gave them life? How could trust and love be twisted into something deadly? And yet, as we examine the Reiner family, patterns emerge that are chillingly familiar in families marked by dysfunction. Unspoken resentments, manipulations, emotional blackmail, jealousy, and a persistent sense that some members were more valued than others. These are the undercurrents that quietly erode bonds, often unnoticed until the dam breaks. In the case of the Reiners, the dam did not just break, it exploded. The morning of the murders, the culmination of years of hidden tension, unaddressed conflict, and emotional suppression revealed itself in a way that was both shocking and inevitable in hindsight. By then, patterns of behavior had hardened, grievances had calcified, and small acts of betrayal had accumulated into a catastrophic outcome. And yet, even as investigators pieced together the events of that day, the larger picture remained elusive. Who did what, and why, was obscured not only by physical evidence, but by layers of deception, half-truths, and lies carefully constructed over decades. It is in this context that we must understand Romy's courtroom testimony, which reframed the narrative entirely. The world had been primed to see Nick as the sole perpetrator, a son gone tragically wrong, succumbing to impulses that led to an unimaginable crime. But Romy's words pierced that assumption, suggesting a complicity far more complex, implicating Tracy, the eldest daughter who had long been seen as a stabilizing force. "She killed my mom and dad," Romy said. Think about the weight of that accusation, not just legally, but emotionally. It forces a confrontation with the darkest possibilities of familial relationships. That's someone you know intimately, someone who shared every holiday, birthday, and milestone, could be capable of unspeakable betrayal. And here is the part that makes this story even more compelling. Every family has its conflicts, yes, but rarely do those conflicts escalate into acts of lethal violence. So what was different here? What made the Reiner household a pressure cooker of grief, resentment, and eventual horror? It wasn't just personality clashes or the stresses of fame and fortune. It was a combination of psychological vulnerabilities, unaddressed anger, jealousy, and a history of patterns that, left unchecked, festered in silence until they erupted. In other words, the seeds of tragedy were planted long before the bodies were found. They had been growing quietly, patiently, and almost invisibly. For the viewers trying to piece this together, imagine the cognitive dissonance. A beloved filmmaker, a loving mother, a seemingly close-knit family, destroyed from within. This is not just a true crime story. It's a study of human behavior, of the dark potential that exists in familial relationships, even among those who seem outwardly perfect. It forces us to reconsider what we know about trust, about love, and about the boundaries between duty and desire. And it forces us to question, when the people we think we know best harbor secrets, how can we ever be sure of their intentions? By the end of this chapter, it becomes clear that the Reiner's story is not merely one of murder, but of a family's slow unraveling, a tragedy made inevitable by hidden grievances, suppressed emotions, and the unseen cracks in their relationships. The stage is set for the horrors to come, the courtroom revelations that will redefine our understanding of the events, and the shocking accusations that will forever taint the names of those involved. The family's public image of perfection was an illusion, and as we peel back the layers, the truth that emerges is far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. It was a Sunday like any other in Brentwood, or so it seemed. The sun rose over manicured lawns, casting long shadows across the streets lined with luxury cars and palm trees. Neighbors went about their routines, oblivious to the nightmare unfolding just a few doors down. Inside the Reiner estate, however, the day was anything but ordinary. By the time the afternoon light hit the grand windows of the living room, the home that had been a sanctuary for decades had transformed into a scene of unimaginable horror. Imagine for a moment the disbelief of the first responders who arrived at the property. A quiet neighborhood, an affluent family, a life that looked perfect on the surface. And then the reality of multiple sharp force injuries, a violent scene that no one could have anticipated, no one could have imagined. Rob Reiner, 78, a man whose films had touched the lives of millions, and Michelle, 70, his devoted partner, had been murdered in their own home. The details, as they later emerged, were gruesome. The couple had been stabbed multiple times, the wounds inflicted with precision and rage. Each injury told a story of violence, anger, and betrayal. It was clear this was not a random act. It was intimate. It was personal. And then there was Nick Reiner. The 32-year-old son, who had been living in the guest house on the property, was arrested that very night. Authorities would later reveal that he had a history of troubling behavior, prior incidents that hinted at instability, and a complicated relationship with his parents. Yet even with these factors, the public was stunned. How could someone raise their hand against the very people who had given them life, love, and opportunity? The question lingered, haunting the minds of investigators, friends, and eventually the audience following the story worldwide. But the story did not begin at the moment of the attack. It began in the hours leading up to it, in the subtle signs that something was off. Neighbors would later recount unusual activity around the property. Staff members mentioned quiet arguments in the early morning, raised voices that were quickly hushed. Small things, easily dismissed at the time, became ominous in hindsight. A door left ajar, a car that arrived unexpectedly, a silence that spoke louder than any words. The tension in the air was palpable, even if no one outside could name its cause. The crime scene itself was chaotic yet meticulous. Investigators found evidence suggesting a struggle, a confrontation that escalated rapidly. Blood spatter patterns indicated that the attack was not a frenzied, uncontrolled act, but deliberate and targeted. Every movement, every wound, spoke of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, who had personal knowledge of the victim's routines and vulnerabilities. This was not the act of a stranger. It was the act of someone who had been inside their lives, inside their home, someone who had access and intimacy that made the betrayal even more incomprehensible. News of the murders spread like wildfire. Headlines screamed the names of Rob and Michelle Reiner. Social media erupted with shock, disbelief, and speculation. Fans of the filmmaker shared memories of his work, tributes flooding in from across the country and around the world. Hollywood insiders expressed grief and confusion. And amidst all of this public reaction, the private reality was even darker. Within the family, fear, confusion, and grief collided. Romy Reiner, the youngest daughter, was grappling not only with the loss of her parents, but with the emerging suspicion that the danger had not come solely from outside the family, but from within. Court records later revealed that Romy had been aware of subtle warning signs leading up to the murders. There had been prior incidents, small but alarming, where her parents had expressed concern about Nick's behavior. Romy, observing from the sidelines, had also noticed troubling dynamics with her eldest sister, Tracy. On the surface, Tracy had appeared composed, rational, and caring, a model of responsibility. But underneath, according to Romy, there had been manipulations, lies, and a quiet ambition that would ultimately intersect with the tragic events of that Sunday. When police finally arrived, the magnitude of the scene became undeniable. The home, which had once symbolized family unity and warmth, was now a crime scene filled with evidence, questions, and horror. Each room told part of the story. The living room bore witness to the initial confrontation. The kitchen, usually a hub of family life, held traces of chaos and struggle. The guest house, where Nick had been living, became a critical focal point for investigators seeking to understand the sequence of events. Every detail mattered. Every observation could shed light on the truth, yet every revelation seemed to raise even more questions. One of the most chilling aspects of that day was the immediacy of suspicion toward Nick. While authorities had grounds based on prior incidents and proximity, the public instinctively sought a simple explanation: a troubled son, acting impulsively. Yet as the investigation unfolded, it became clear that the story was more complex. Nick may have been involved, But according to Romy's later testimony, the chain of events could not be explained by his actions alone. There were layers of deceit, manipulation, and hidden motives that complicated the narrative and challenged anyone attempting to make sense of it. Family members were thrown into emotional chaos. The siblings were contacted, interviewed, and eventually summoned to court. Romy, in particular, had to reconcile her grief with a sense of moral duty. She knew that speaking the truth, even when it implicated her sister Tracy, was necessary. The courtroom would become the stage for a confrontation that was as emotional as it was revealing. It was here that Romy's courage would shine, and where the public would begin to understand the depth of the family's hidden turmoil. But beyond the immediate family, the events of that day sent ripples through Hollywood and beyond. Rob Reiner had been a beloved figure in the film industry for decades, and his sudden death under violent circumstances was unprecedented. Tributes poured in, yet the public fascination quickly shifted from mourning to speculation. How could such a tragedy happen in a home filled with love, privilege, and apparent stability? What led to the escalation from ordinary family disagreements to murder? These questions, unanswered at the time, would dominate the investigation and the media coverage for months to come. The Day of Horror was not simply a moment of violence. It was the culmination of years of tension, resentment, and hidden conflict. To fully understand it, we must look beyond the surface, beyond the headlines, and examine the subtle warning signs, the underlying psychological dynamics, and the interpersonal relationships that created a volatile environment. Every family member played a role, whether knowingly or unknowingly, in the events that led to that Sunday. And as the investigation would reveal, it was not just Nick who had acted. There were deeper layers of complicity and manipulation at play, pointing to motivations that were personal, strategic, and disturbingly intimate. For viewers trying to make sense of this, imagine the emotional impact on Romy, standing amidst the wreckage of her family's life. Not only had she lost her parents in a shocking act of violence, but she had also come to realize that her sister Tracy, someone she had trusted implicitly, may have played a role in orchestrating the events that led to that day. The betrayal was unimaginable, and yet it would become the central thread of the unfolding courtroom drama, driving the narrative forward and keeping the public riveted. The Day of Horror was only the beginning. While the initial arrests and headlines captured attention, the true story, the story of family secrets, sibling betrayals, and decades-long tension, was only just beginning to emerge. As investigators combed through the evidence, piecing together movements, conversations, and actions, the complexity of the case became clear. Every detail mattered. Every interaction was scrutinized, and every revelation had the potential to change the direction of the investigation entirely. By the end of that day, the Reiner estate had transformed from a place of warmth and security into a crime scene marked by grief, fear, and suspicion. It was a place where a family's darkest dynamics had been exposed in the most violent way possible. And for Romy, it was a moment of reckoning. The moment when she realized that the danger was not only in the hands of her brother Nick, but possibly her sister Tracy as well. The stage was set for a courtroom confrontation that would expose lies, manipulate perceptions, and reveal truths that had been buried for years. Every family has stories it never tells, corners of memory it keeps locked away, and moments of tension that are quietly swept under the rug. In the Reiner household, those corners were dark, layered, and more treacherous than anyone outside the family could have imagined. From the outside, they were a perfect Hollywood family. A celebrated father, a devoted mother, and children who had grown up in privilege, love, and opportunity. But appearances, as Romy Reiner would later reveal in court, were deceiving. The cracks had been there for years, hidden, subtle, and insidious, but they were cracks that would eventually become the very fault lines along which tragedy struck. Tracy Reiner, the eldest, had always carried herself with a sense of responsibility and composure. She was, to many, the model child, the daughter who could handle delicate situations, the one who seemed most aligned with her parents' expectations. But what the public, and even much of the family, didn't see were the quiet moments of manipulation, the strategic decisions that Tracy had made over the years, and the simmering resentments that had been carefully concealed behind a mask of compliance. Romy would later testify that there were signs, long before the murders, that Tracy had ambitions and grievances that were not openly discussed. She watched her sister navigate the family with a blend of charm and calculation, always seeking approval while quietly exerting influence. Nick, the middle child, had a very different relationship with his parents and siblings. His actions would dominate the headlines after the murders, but to understand the tragedy, we must look deeper. Nick had exhibited troubling behaviors in the years leading up to that fateful Sunday. Outbursts, attempts at aggression, and prior conflicts that hinted at a volatile temperament. While Rob and Michelle had tried to provide guidance and discipline, it seemed that their efforts were not always effective. Romy, as the youngest, had witnessed both the conflicts and the attempts at reconciliation. She saw the quiet battles over attention, the subtle power struggles, and the patterns that no outsider could have recognized. Romy herself had always been perceptive, perhaps more so than her older sister. She noticed the ways in which Tracy would maneuver situations to her advantage, the ways in which she could manipulate conversations and influence perceptions. She saw the moments when Nick's anger would flare and when the parents' attempts to mediate would fail. And while Romy did not fully grasp the extent to which these dynamics could lead to violence, she intuitively understood that the family was not as harmonious as the public believed. The Reiner estate itself became a kind of pressure cooker. On the surface, it was beautiful, sprawling rooms, manicured gardens, and spaces designed for comfort and entertainment. But within those walls, emotions ran deep, and the proximity of family members created friction. Small disagreements that might have been trivial in another household became magnified in this environment. Decisions about inheritance, attention, and perceived favoritism created fault lines that were difficult to bridge. Over time, the cumulative effect of these tensions laid the groundwork for catastrophic events. One of the most critical aspects of understanding the Reiners' internal dynamics is recognizing the role of unspoken resentments. Tracy, as the eldest, carried expectations that were both explicit and implicit. She was expected to lead by example, to maintain decorum, and to act as a stabilizing force. But these expectations also created pressure, and Romy would later reveal that there were moments when Tracy's frustration boiled over, manifesting in manipulative or even cruel behavior toward her siblings. The younger children, especially Romy, were caught in a web of loyalty, fear, and confusion, unsure how to navigate the emotional landscape their eldest sister had shaped. In addition to sibling dynamics, there were parent-child tensions that played a significant role in the family's dysfunction. Rob and Michelle, though loving, were not perfect parents. They had expectations, standards, and a vision of family that did not always align with the desires and behaviors of their children. In some cases, this misalignment led to conflict, particularly with Nick, whose actions were increasingly erratic. Romy's later testimony suggested that while the parents sought to mediate and maintain order, they were sometimes blindsided by the deeper undercurrents of resentment and ambition that flowed through their children. The complex relationships within the Reiner household created a situation in which loyalty and betrayal coexisted in tension. Romy's observation of her sister Tracy's behavior, combined with the escalating volatility of Nick, set the stage for the tragic events to come. In court, Romy described instances where Tracy's decisions, words, and actions suggested a willingness to manipulate situations for her benefit, even at the expense of family harmony. These revelations were shocking, not only because of their content, but because they painted a picture of a family in which appearances were meticulously maintained, while danger and deception simmered just beneath the surface. It is important to note that family secrets are not always malicious. They can also stem from fear, shame, or the desire to protect loved ones. In the Reiner household, however, the combination of secrecy, manipulation, and unresolved tension created a volatile mix. Minor grievances festered, small acts of manipulation accumulated, and the resulting emotional pressure made the family vulnerable to extreme outcomes. The tragic deaths of Rob and Michelle were not simply the result of one impulsive act. They were the culmination of years of unaddressed issues, conflicts, and hidden dynamics. Romy's testimony also highlighted the ways in which these tensions manifested in everyday life. She recounted conversations, observations, and interactions that, in hindsight, pointed to a deeper malaise within the family. Arguments that seemed trivial at the time were actually indicative of power struggles and hidden resentments. Moments of favoritism or perceived slight were magnified, creating divisions that weakened the family's cohesion. These small but significant dynamics, when combined with the psychological vulnerabilities of individual family members, created a situation in which tragedy became increasingly likely. Another element of the hidden tension was the perception of control. Tracy, as the eldest, often sought to assert influence over family decisions and interactions. Romy observed this control not only in interactions with their parents, but also in subtle ways that shaped the behavior of her siblings. While outwardly maintaining a facade of caring and responsibility, Tracy's underlying motivations, as revealed later in court, suggested a willingness to manipulate outcomes for personal advantage. These actions, seemingly minor on their own, accumulated over time, creating an environment in which trust was eroded and resentment grew. In addition to sibling dynamics, there were broader questions about loyalty, morality, and the nature of familial bonds. Romy's perspective, informed by years of observation and experience, emphasized the complexity of these relationships. Trust, she revealed, had been fragile within the Reiner household for a long time. Moments of betrayal, whether perceived or real, were woven into the fabric of daily life. The result was a family in which appearances of unity and affection masked deeper fractures that would ultimately lead to catastrophic consequences. By examining these hidden tensions, we begin to understand that the tragedy was not an isolated event, but part of a continuum. Every argument, every act of manipulation, every unspoken grievance contributed to the conditions that made the murders possible. The Reiner story is a stark reminder that family relationships, even those that appear ideal from the outside, can harbor hidden dangers when conflicts are left unresolved and emotions are suppressed. As the family navigated these tensions, none could have anticipated the scale of the violence that would erupt. Romy's later revelations underscored the profound disconnect between public perception and private reality. To the world, the Reiners were a loving, harmonious family. Behind closed doors, however, they were a family at war with itself, caught in a web of resentment, ambition, and unspoken conflict. These dynamics, combined with the volatile personalities of the children, particularly Nick and Tracy, created a scenario in which tragedy was tragically inevitable. And yet, even in the midst of these tensions, moments of love and normalcy existed. Holidays were celebrated, birthdays were remembered, and family rituals continued. These moments of apparent unity served to heighten the shock when tragedy struck, reinforcing the contrast between the family's outward appearance and the dark reality lurking beneath. Romy's testimony highlighted this duality, emphasizing the painful irony of a family that could appear so loving while harboring such dangerous secrets. The stage was now set for the events that would dominate headlines, courtrooms, and the public imagination. The hidden tensions, sibling rivalries, and unspoken resentments had created a perfect storm. Romy, as the observer and eventual whistleblower, provided the lens through which the world would come to understand the complexity of this family drama. Her insights revealed that the tragedy was not merely the result of one individual's actions, but a consequence of years of hidden conflict, psychological pressure, and emotional manipulation. The courtroom was silent, but the tension was almost palpable, like the air before a storm breaks. Outside, media crews jostled for position, cameras zooming in on the entrance to the Los Angeles County Courthouse, where a story that had captured the world was about to take center stage in its most dramatic act yet. Inside, the seats were filled with a mix of legal personnel, journalists, and a handful of family members, all bracing for a confrontation that would forever alter the public perception of the Reiners. At the heart of it all sat Tracy Reiner, poised but visibly tense, her fingers laced together, knuckles white, eyes darting briefly toward her youngest sister, Romy, who had taken her place on the witness stand. Imagine what that moment must have felt like for everyone in the room. A family's private tragedy laid bare under the scrutiny of law and media alike. The weight of expectation, of grief, and of accusation pressed on the participants with an almost tangible force. Romy, small but resolute, had been preparing for this day mentally and emotionally for months. She knew what she had to say, and she knew the impact it could have not only on her family but on the public's understanding of the case. The prosecutor's opening remarks set the tone, painting a picture of a violent crime that had devastated a family and shocked a city. They spoke of Nick Reiner's arrest, the discovery of the bodies, and the initial evidence pointing to his son's impulsive actions. But then came the pivot, the subtle shift in focus that would change everything. The suggestion that there may have been complicity, that the story was far more complicated than anyone had imagined. And that pivot came through Romy, who was about to speak in a way that no one expected. Romy took a deep breath and began, her voice steady at first, then quivering as the emotional weight of her words hit. She spoke of the family dynamics, the hidden tensions, and the subtle manipulations that had been part of her upbringing. She described Tracy not just as an elder sister, but as someone whose actions and decisions had, at times, been controlling, strategic, and, according to Romy, morally questionable. Each word landed like a stone in a pond, sending ripples of shock through the courtroom. Observers noted the mixture of grief and anger in Romy's expression. The emotional stakes were high. Tracy sat silently, her composure strained, every so often glancing at her sister with a mixture of disbelief and fear. The tension between them was a physical presence, thick and heavy, impossible to ignore. For Romy, speaking these truths meant confronting not just the past, but the present reality. The reality that her parents were gone, that Nick had been arrested, and that the person she once trusted implicitly, her eldest sister, may have had a hand in the horror. Courtroom proceedings, by nature, are structured and procedural, yet in this case, the raw human emotion threatened to overwhelm the formality. Lawyers, judges, and clerks moved through the motions, but the heart of the matter was human drama, betrayal, grief, fear, and the unimaginable possibility of familial murder. Romy's testimony introduced an element that no one outside the family had anticipated. The suggestion that Tracy had played a deeper role in the events that led to her parents' deaths. It was a revelation that would dominate headlines, spark public outrage, and force investigators to reconsider the narrative they had initially accepted. The cross-examination was even more intense. Tracy's defense team attempted to undermine Romy's credibility, questioning her motives, her recollections, and her interpretations of past events. But Romy remained firm, recounting details that were both specific and emotionally charged, incidents of manipulation, moments when Tracy's ambition seemed to override compassion, and patterns of behavior that suggested a calculated, if not sinister, influence. Each point Romy made added depth to the story, painting a portrait of a family at war with itself, where appearances masked a far more disturbing reality. Witness after witness corroborated aspects of Romy's account. Friends, neighbors, and household staff provided context, revealing moments of tension, unusual behavior, and subtle conflicts that had been invisible to outsiders but unmistakable to those living within the Reiner household. These testimonies added layers of complexity, creating a narrative that went beyond a single act of violence and into the realm of long-standing familial dysfunction. The courtroom became a stage where decades of secrets, grievances, and unspoken resentments were brought into the harsh light of scrutiny. Perhaps the most shocking element of the courtroom drama was the emotional toll it took on Tracy. The eldest daughter, long perceived as the stabilizing force, began to show signs of strain under the weight of her sister's revelations. She shifted in her seat, avoided eye contact, and occasionally appeared on the verge of tears. Observers noted the contradiction between the composed public persona she had maintained for decades and the vulnerability she now displayed. It was a stark reminder that in families marked by hidden tension, appearances can be deceptive, and even the most controlled individuals may have cracks that are exposed under pressure. For Romy, the act of speaking out was both cathartic and terrifying. She knew the implications of her testimony, not just legally, but emotionally. She was challenging the public image of her family, questioning the morality of her sister, and confronting the grief that had consumed her since that Sunday when her parents were killed. Her courage was undeniable, and her words resonated with both the courtroom audience and the millions following the story in the media. Each revelation was a calculated risk, a moment where truth and emotion intersected in a way that few witnesses ever experience. Outside the courtroom, public reaction was immediate and intense. Social media erupted with discussions about the family, speculation about Tracy's possible involvement, and debates about the psychological dynamics at play. News outlets dissected every moment of Romy's testimony, analyzing her expressions, her tone, and the implications of her statements. The story had shifted from a tragic murder committed by a troubled son to a far more complex and morally ambiguous narrative involving sibling betrayal, long-standing family secrets, and the unsettling possibility that the violence was not entirely isolated. Within the courtroom, every pause, every word, every glance carried significance. Romy's account forced not only the legal system but also the public to grapple with uncomfortable questions. Can we ever truly know the people closest to us? How do hidden resentments accumulate? And at what point do they erupt into irreversible actions? And perhaps most chillingly, could someone we love and trust be capable of orchestrating or influencing the very tragedy we fear most? These questions, while unanswerable in simple terms, hung over the proceedings like a shadow, framing every decision, every reaction, and every testimony that followed. As the day wore on, the tension escalated. Romy's statements painted a portrait of a household in which appearances had been meticulously maintained, masking a network of control, manipulation, and subtle intimidation. The courtroom audience, both present and remote, was forced to confront the reality that this was not a simple story of a son's impulsive violence, but a complex interplay of psychological and familial dynamics. The revelation that Tracy, the eldest, might have played a more active role in the events leading to her parents' deaths turned the narrative on its head, challenging assumptions and forcing a reevaluation of the family's public image. By the end of the proceedings that day, it was clear that the courtroom drama had only just begun. The stage had been set, the players were in position, and the public had been given a glimpse into a story that was far more intricate and disturbing than headlines alone could convey. Romy's courage in speaking out, the legal strategies employed by both sides, and the unfolding tension between the siblings created a dynamic that would dominate the coming months of investigation and trial, would reveal even deeper layers of deception, manipulation, and hidden agendas. Layers that would shock not just the family, but the world watching. The courtroom was no longer just a venue for legal proceedings. It had become the arena in which decades of secrets, betrayals, and unspoken conflicts would be exposed, tested, and ultimately brought to light. The moment Romy Reiner took the stand, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. It was one thing to hear the facts of the murders, the police reports, the crime scene photos, the forensic analysis. But it was another thing entirely to hear from the youngest daughter, someone who had lived through every nuance of the family's hidden tensions, who had witnessed the cracks forming over decades, and who now had the courage to speak the truth aloud. This was not just testimony. It was a revelation, a direct confrontation with the darkest corners of a family's history. Romy began cautiously, describing her memories of childhood, the idyllic moments intertwined with subtle but persistent signs of dysfunction. She spoke of her parents' love, of the traditions that shaped their lives, and of the public image of unity that the family maintained. But then, almost imperceptibly at first, her words shifted. She began to reveal the cracks. The arguments that left lasting marks, the favoritism that sowed resentment, and the emotional manipulations that had gone unnoticed by outsiders but were unmistakable to those living inside the home. Her testimony was emotional, raw, and at times heart-wrenching. She described instances where her eldest sister, Tracy, wielded influence over family decisions, sometimes in ways that seemed benign, but at other times, according to Romy, were calculated and self-serving. Romy's descriptions painted a picture of a sibling who had long been ambitious, who had a knack for controlling narratives and guiding outcomes to her advantage, and who may have acted in ways that prioritized her interests over family unity or parental well-being. The courtroom was silent as Romy recounted these stories. Every word seemed to echo in the minds of those present, forcing them to reconcile the image of a loving, harmonious family with the reality of conflict, manipulation, and subtle coercion. It was clear that Romy had spent years observing and processing these dynamics, and her recollections were precise, filled with details that made it difficult for anyone to dismiss them as exaggeration or hearsay. One of the most chilling parts of Romy's testimony was her account of the moments leading directly up to her parents' deaths. She described a household fraught with tension, arguments that had been escalating over time, and a sense that danger was looming, though no one could have anticipated the violence that would erupt. She spoke of Nick's volatility, of his confrontations with the family, and of the moments when Tracy's interventions, according to Romy, may have influenced the course of events. Her testimony suggested a level of planning or at least a strategic awareness that went beyond the impulsive actions of a single family member. As Romy spoke, the courtroom atmosphere shifted from one of procedural observation to intense emotional engagement. Legal experts later noted that her narrative introduced a complexity that was difficult to navigate. The intertwining of personal grievances, sibling dynamics, and psychological factors made it challenging to separate motive from opportunity, intent from circumstance. In other words, Romy was not simply recounting a crime. She was unraveling a tapestry of human behavior that spanned decades, exposing the forces that culminated in murder. Her words were also punctuated by questions posed directly to the audience, questions not just for those present in the courtroom, but for anyone following the story. Can someone you trust implicitly become a threat without warning? She asked. Is it possible to hide ambition, resentment, and malice behind a facade of love and care? These rhetorical questions served as both reflection and provocation, forcing listeners to consider the fragility of trust and the complexity of familial relationships. Romy did not shy away from the emotional reality of the situation. She described her grief, her fear, and her confusion in the aftermath of the murders. She spoke candidly about the moment she realized that the person she had trusted most, her eldest sister, may have played a role in orchestrating events that led to the deaths of their parents. The words hung heavy in the courtroom, betrayal so intimate it defied comprehension. Her honesty, vulnerability, and clarity made her testimony both credible and deeply compelling. One of the pivotal moments of her testimony involved specific incidents that illustrated Tracy's manipulative tendencies. Romy recounted conversations where Tracy had subtly undermined her parents' decisions, influenced the behavior of Nick, and positioned herself as indispensable to the family dynamic. Each story added weight to the argument that Tracy's influence had extended beyond ordinary sibling behavior into the realm of strategic manipulation, a factor that could not be ignored in understanding the events that led to the murders. The prosecution carefully guided Romy through these accounts, ensuring that each point was tied to the broader narrative of the family's dysfunction and the circumstances surrounding the deaths. They emphasized patterns, repeated behaviors, consistent strategies, and the psychological dynamics that made the Reiner household uniquely volatile. By the time Romy finished her initial testimony, it was clear that the narrative of a simple crime of passion was insufficient. The story was far more complex, and the implications for Tracy were serious. The defense, of course, attempted to challenge Romy's credibility, suggesting bias, emotional distress, and selective memory. But Romy's clarity, her detailed recollections, and her emotional authenticity made these attacks less effective than anticipated. She presented herself not as an adversary, but as a witness, a survivor, and someone committed to revealing the truth, no matter how painful. Her testimony became a defining moment in the case, forcing both the court and the public to reconsider what they thought they knew about the family and the circumstances of the murders. Perhaps most striking was Romy's ability to connect past behavior to the events of the day itself. She drew lines between years of tension, manipulation, and sibling rivalry, and the explosive outcome that had resulted in her parents' deaths. In doing so, she provided a psychological and emotional framework that allowed the court and the public to understand how tragedy could unfold within a seemingly ordinary family. Her insights were not just observational, they were analytical, connecting dots that had previously been invisible. Throughout her testimony, Romy balanced grief with determination, emotion with precision. She made it clear that her purpose was not vengeance, but truth. Her courage in facing her sister, recounting painful memories, and exposing decades of hidden tension was extraordinary. The courtroom witnessed not just the recounting of events, but the unraveling of a family's carefully maintained facade, layer by layer, revealing the complexity, the betrayal, and the heartbreak beneath. By the end of Romy's testimony, it was undeniable. This was a story of family dynamics gone terribly wrong, of secrets, ambition, and manipulation intersecting with tragedy. Her words left the courtroom in stunned silence, a mixture of empathy, disbelief, and horror hanging in the air. The narrative had shifted. What began as a murder case against a troubled son had evolved into a far more intricate and morally complex story involving sibling betrayal, long-standing emotional manipulation, and the devastating consequences of hidden family tension. Evidence is often described as cold, impartial, and objective. But in cases like the Reiner family tragedy, evidence carries a weight far beyond mere facts. It is the material proof that turns suspicion into certainty, rumor into reality, and emotional speculation into courtroom drama. The day investigators entered the Reiner estate, they did not just encounter a crime scene. They encountered a labyrinth of clues, contradictions, and signs that the simple narrative of a son's impulsive violence was incomplete. Each piece of evidence added layers to a story that would soon shock the world. From the outset, the physical evidence was both horrifying and revealing. The bodies of Rob and Michelle Reiner displayed multiple sharp force injuries, each wound carefully documented by forensic specialists. The pattern of the injuries suggested intent, control, and familiarity, the kind of precision that spoke to someone who knew the victims intimately. Investigators noted that the violence was concentrated in specific areas, indicative not of a frenzied attack, but of targeted aggression. These were not random acts of anger. They were intimate, deliberate, and deeply personal. But it was the additional context, items in the house, the placement of objects, the state of doors and windows, that hinted at a far more complicated scenario. Footprints, fingerprints, and traces of movement within the home suggested that more than one person may have been involved in manipulating the environment leading up to the murders. Security footage, which initially seemed unremarkable, was scrutinized for anomalies. Unusual comings and goings, vehicles parked at odd hours, and interactions that did not align with standard family routines. These small discrepancies became significant under the lens of an investigation that sought to uncover not just who committed the act, but how and why. Investigators also reviewed communications, texts, emails, and social media messages that painted a portrait of family tension escalating in the weeks prior to the tragedy. Messages that seemed innocuous on the surface took on new meaning when analyzed alongside forensic findings. References to disputes over finances, subtle threats, and veiled accusations suggested that the family's conflict was deepening and becoming more personal. Experts later testified that these communications indicated premeditation or at least awareness of escalating risks, complicating the initial narrative of a sudden, impulsive act. For Romy, the evidence corroborated what she had long suspected and what she courageously revealed in court. Specific instances of manipulation, particularly involving Tracy, were reflected in emails and messages where decisions were subtly influenced, attention was redirected, or events were framed in ways that created tension between family members.